Hey everybody, I'm Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads, and with me I have Jake Payne, our editor-in-chief, and together, this is our What's the Headline podcast. What's happening, man?
Yo, man, another day in paradise. It's finally the fall, my favorite season of the year. I don't know about you. I see it's hoodie season for you, which is great.
Yeah, you got that
Um,
Christmas and the crispness and the breeze here, you know?
yeah, man, that's what I look forward to. We got that. We got holidays coming up. You could still be outside, but yeah, man, we got some great hip hop news. You and I took a week off, and I was stunned at the people that were hitting us up, saying, "Yo, what'd you guys do? You can't be consistent." So we had to, we had to come back with some content.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And hopefully we got a special guest coming up soon too. One that we're very excited about, but we'll see about that. But let's kick it off, man. So I think one of the biggest reactions we got this week was a very surprising reunion. There was no lead up, no build up to anything like this. Just they dropped it one day, and the next day, boom, they're on stage together, and that was the Fugees.
Yeah, man, Fuji La. I did not in a million years see this coming. Just even think it was in the air. Did you?
Not remotely, man. I could have foreseen Lauren doing something solo after that Nas verse, on Nobody, just because so much momentum. It sounded like her pen game was sharp, like she'd been writing and been in the studio. So that wouldn't have surprised me. But the Fugees together, that's wild to me.
Yeah, I mean, earlier this year, the score, the reason they got back together is 25 years of the score, which is obviously their, benchmark album. I would say, certainly a music classic, but a hip hop classic for sure. And back in February, when the real anniversary is, even her Instagram post was like a fan reminded me that this album was turning 25. And, you know, I don't think any of the three Fugees, Wyclef, Pras, or Miss Lauryn Hill, spend a lot of time living in the past at this point. So yeah, I mean, this one was a sneak attack, and even down to whether or not we would report on it, given kind of our current content strategy, you and I, weren't even sure that it was a dial mover, which is funny because it turned out to be a big one.
Gigantic, So let's talk about this for a second because we have gone back and forth over the years on which anniversaries to cover.
Yeah.
We don't do like every single year because that gets tired and played out after a while. We tend to focus on the fives and the tens, so 10 years is a big one. 15 years seems to not resonate as much. We found that 20 years was kind of like our sweet spot in terms of like really, generating a lot of hype and interest. But 25 now seems to be a big one that the groups themselves, the artists themselves push. So what do you think about that, man? Which anniversary do you think is the most significant? Now we got 30 years too. We just had Tribe's Low End Theory.
And it's funny because for that one of our biggest articles this week was the 25 anniversary piece that you and Amanda Bonita Mester had worked on, and I had edited back and transcribed in 2016. And, and I'm glad to see that content still matters. I am often just overwhelmed with anniversaries. You'll see 5, 10, 15. I think the 25 matters, but I think hip hop is getting to a place. I mean, you go back 25 and 30 years right now, and that is the sweet spot of so many albums that hip hop heads hold near and dear to their heart. But I think for something like this, 25 makes sense. We saw something earlier in the year. Last year, actually, we interviewed Havoc for 25 years of Mobb Deep's The Infamous. And this year, it was 25 years since ATL Leons by Outkast. And I think the labels get involved a lot, and 25 is the big one. I think the rock and roll community and the jazz community, R&B, has made a big to-do of 25. So that will be the one that I think gets a lot of the attention. But that doesn't mean that every site out there, every publication, every person on Twitter isn't going to, throw their hat in the air for 5, 10, 15, and 20.
Yeah, you think about college reunions, and 25 seems to be the big one for college.
Okay.
And part of that is because it's that time when a lot of people have kids that are about to go into college and they're looking for that big check, So
I didn't even think of that.
And now it's pushed out to 30 because people are having kids older.
Yeah.
But what do you think drives it for music and for artistry in general?
I mean, this is going to sound cynical, but I think there's an opportunity to monetize it. And you look at it, I think the Fugees are a rare exception, but you know, Mobb Deep, and we didn't talk to Havoc about this, but you know, their first album didn't do so well, you know, Juvenile Hell, and then they come back and presumably I don't think Loud Records would have signed them and done that deal in a hugely artist favorable sort of way. So you make a classic album. It's what people want to see when you're performing. And if you get an opportunity later in life to do merchandise, to do touring, to do a documentary like Nas did with Illmatic, I think that that's going to make sense. And it's just a cool stopping point because 25 years later, just like, you know, college reunions, you are at a whole different place in life. And it's really cool that for hip hop heads, you can look at a Raekwon or an Outkast or a Mobb Deep or a Fugees and see these artists evolve and be in totally different places, but take time to kind of come back and give fans, you know, what they remember, what they want. This is about nostalgia too. And I guarantee you, I mean, the Fugees announced a tour. These ticket prices are going to be up, up, up. And these are going to be sold out shows, especially with, you know, the way audiences are being regulated. But I mean, it's going to be a money opportunity for three very talented artists. But do you disagree at all? Do you think that?
Yeah, I think money drives cash rules everything around me, you know. Yeah. So I think that's a big part of it. But I agree with everything you said. It's also a great time to go back and reflect on these massive achievements, you know, the greatness of the group, the greatness of the album. You know, your point about ticket prices is right, because I saw someone on IG posted they were trying to purchase tickets for the New York show that happened the day after the announcement, and they were like $700 each. Wow. Which is absolutely absurd. I think it was like $48 list price or something like that. So tickets are out of control. But you know, taking it back, you know, hip hop, I think at first 20 years was the right thing because it's still such a young genre, relatively speaking. And so the notion of, you know, great art being made 20 years ago for hip hop was, you know, that seemed like a long time ago. But as it continues to age, I think 25 years is the one that is kind of universal for all anniversaries across every category as the big one, you know. So it makes sense to me. And after that, I think 30 years, 35, 40, 50, you know, starts to lose resonance because people weren't around at that time, or, you know, it's just not, doesn't have the same impact. So it's kind of like that line between, you know, old enough to be reverent, but not so old that it's irrelevant, you know?
That's really well said. And I think it's cool. I mean, you know, somebody out there will be celebrating all of these different benchmarks, whether it's 20 or 25. And that has to be cool for the artist because, you know, there was a period of time when AFH was publishing, you know, 3 to 5 stories a day where we did celebrate a lot of anniversaries. And one of the reasons we did that wasn't to get page views, but we wanted to, you know, offer something different in the space. So, you know, the Low End Theory one, to go speak to Skeff Anselm and Bob Power and have conversations with people that are going to be different than what you might see at another publication is valuable. And even in looking at the Fugees 25 for the score, you know, I'm proud of the fact that you and I and Amanda and the rest of our team, you know, we put in work. We celebrated a lot of things that dropped nuggets and anecdotes about these albums that are right here when the rest of the world is ready to celebrate.
Word. So let's talk about the Fugees and why it is such a big deal, why people want to celebrate them. So I want to talk about them as an artist, but also this album, because this album, you know, their first album, to your point about Mobb Deep, their first album didn't do that well. You know, they had a single called The Vocab, and it did okay. And then
Nappy Heads too was
Nappy Heads did all right too, but I mean, I don't even remember that one. I don't think most people will, you know. But it was, and the album kind of languished. But it was when the Vocab remix came out that it changed everything. You know, that actually put them back on people's radar, made them excited. Lauryn, you know, always, you know, incredible on that. Wyclef was dope. But when the score dropped, I don't think anyone was ready for the impact of that album. And most people attribute the success to Killing Me Softly, right? Lauryn's remake of Roberta Flack's classic. And that song was incredible, But for hip hop heads, the album was so much more than that. I mean, you had the title track by, Diamond D. You had so many other great songs from
Fuji La,
Fuji La, yeah. And it was a great hip hop album, great rap. It was great songs, great singing, great musicality. What does it represent to you? Because I know you probably caught it later on in life. When you went back to it, what did it say to you?
No, 96 was the year that I really started to get all in on hip hop. And, my cousin had the album, dropped the same month, I believe the same day as Tupac's All Eyes on Me, which, was an album that I was very much bumping in 96, a lot of. And yeah, the Fugees came in, and I thought that, oftentimes we credit kind of this pop sampling wave to Puff Daddy and Bad Boy, and sometimes to Jermaine Dupri and So Def, two guys we may talk about later in this podcast. But the Fugees had a sound that I thought was so interesting because they could tap into so many different aspects of culture. And I think, your point. So, the Fugees are one of the ultimate comeback stories. These three artists meet in high school, Maplewood, New Jersey, Columbia High School. Pras and Wyclef are cousins. Lauryn Hill reportedly, auditions for Pras to be in a group, meets Wyclef. They change their names a number of times. That first album, it even says the Fugees, AKA the Translator Crew. And that was their original name. And then, most heads know they also kind of dubbed themselves the Refugee Camp, which was a play on the fact that, Wyclef and Pras are of Haitian descent. This term refugee was often used for, Haitian immigrants, disparagingly often, but they really embraced that side of culture. And they make this album, and it's funny, I never listened to Blunted on Reality. It was something then that I didn't feel like when I heard, because that was one of the cases. The score comes out, it does all it does, and then, like a lot of times, you want to go back and listen to the catalog leading up to. And there is just such a disconnect. But I remember when we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the score, you linked me up with Salam Rami, who produced Fuji La on the score, but also made the Nappy Heads remix, and I believe the Vocab remix that you alluded to. So they make this album, and they get one more video out of Rough House Records. And at this point, they can just kind of disappear into the abyss, or they can see what happens. And they make the Nappy Heads remix, which is really interesting because it does what the Fugees would later do so well. It has samples, it has a bit of dance hall just to its bop. But then they break into Corey Hart, I Wear My Sunglasses at Night. They do these different cues that are going to hit different parts of the audience. You and I spent some time talking about the way that Drake with Certified Lover Boy hits all these different pockets that he's created. I think the Fugees, in introducing themselves, definitely made records that could reach the hardcore hip hop, which was very prevalent in the mid 90s. And then they reached, the kind of on the peripheral, maybe the white kids, or maybe the kids that, might have known a few records by so-and-so. And they use that song for an album that did so poorly. That song goes to right around the top 50 of the Billboard charts. I looked at it this morning and I was stunned. And that gave them enough momentum to get a second album. And that formula, and Salam had told me, so that kind of begins things. Then they make Fuji La, which, was a beat originally kind of being shopped to Fat Joe, which is crazy. And Wyclef reportedly was like, yo, Salam, man, let me do something to that. They had gone in to record something for the Clockers soundtrack, the Spike Lee joint. They never make the soundtrack, but while they're in the studio, they're like, yo, let's do two. Let's do this other record. So they did Fuji La, which they really built the score around. And it's crazy because Salam only gets one credit on the album. But I think of these stories in hip hop of Kanye going to Jay-Z with a beat tape that eventually becomes the blueprint, with Just Blaze and Bink and all of these different people contributing with a cohesive sound. And I feel like that's what you get with the score. This aspect of yo, let's take records, and they aren't the on the nose records that Puffy uses. You probably, just because of our age difference, were you familiar with the Roberta Flack joint growing up?
Yeah, I'd heard it. For sure. Yeah.
Delphonics, Ready or Not, would know these records. I might have heard them in the periphery, but they come in, they sound familiar, but then they flip them fresh. I mean, the one for me is, my mom was a Bob Marley head, so the Fugees came in and redid No Woman, No Cry. And on one hand, it's a cover, but on the other, they do enough to make it their own record. Where, I believe they performed that this week in New York, and that continues to be a crowd favorite. That formula that the Fugees have is just phenomenal. And to your point, it's sort of like what we say with Biz Markie. There's so much depth behind the hits. When I listen to the Fugees, Killing Me Softly is never the first song that I play. That's never the one that I seek out. I'm happy with it. I think it's a great record. But I liked when they hit that kind of pocket of Doing All Things. And the Vocab remix, for sure, is that. Because you got Day to Day Nightmares. You've got all of these different elements that just created such an original group, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it was such a massive, massive success. It's weird because the Fugees have such cultural impact, but only put out 2 albums. And for most people, they only know one.
Yeah.
And yet here we are 25 years later, and their announcement creates a seismic explosion. You've got people like, clamoring for tickets and paying 8 times what they cost, basically off one album, And so, how much though, so I want to talk about what they had to overcome to get to this place in Reunion as well. But how much of this reaction do you think is to the Fugees versus, the Fugees plus Lauryn and what she brings to the table? Because, she had a very similar kind of arc that the group did, has 2 albums technically, one being, the kind of MTV Live one. But one album that shifted culture and stands as a classic to this day in the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, that added to the lore of, I think, the group. I think when people think of them, they think Lauryn first, then they think Clef, and I think people give Clef his props, as the kind of musical maestro behind the scenes, like making things happen, and obviously multi-talented with the ability to play multiple instruments. And sing and rap himself, and he had success too with his solo albums. And Pras kind of being like the person that people like think of more distantly as part of the group. So, again, how much do you think of this is a reaction to the group being together and the story behind it and the music they did versus it being a combination of the group, but also people being excited about getting Lauryn as well?
I definitely think it's B. I mean, I think if Wyclef and Pras do this without Lauryn's participation, it's not a story for a lot of people. I mean, if anything, it's a story that's a kind of an unfortunate punchline. But the fact that, it's wild to me because the group has all this success, to your point. The score happens. By Pras's count, it sells 22 million copies worldwide, which means it went diamond twice. Like, that's insane. By the RIAA, which, tracks primarily domestic sales, it's 7 times platinum. That still puts it in a very, very, very elite class. And the album represents so much, and there's never a follow-up. You get the B-sides and bootlegs joint, which is kind of an EP with some remixes, and some of which we're talking about right now with Vocab and some different things like that. But, to I think this is the closest thing to the fact of, learning that A Tribe Called Quest had that album in 2016 with Phife. Because I don't think anyone saw that happening, especially after the documentary. And, Lauryn is making her way back into the spotlight, especially on the Nas record. Lauryn has toured solo. I mean, she's done tours with Nas and with other artists, but to see this, no one saw it coming. And I feel like it's a touchstone of 25 years ago, but it's also like, is this really happening moment? And the fact that there's only a dozen dates, it's a really big deal. And I think one of the other things is this is one of the first big tours by an artist, not a music festival, that's happening in this weird kind of, is it post, is it not post-COVID world? And for a lot of people that have been hungry to go to shows and have an Instagrammable were you there moment, this represents that, especially in a city like New York.
Yeah, some of the trolling I saw online was, people were asking if Lauryn knew that the reunion was happening. And they were also talking about, that they probably needed to announce it today so she could get to the show on time. But that made me think about the nobody line that she had about, like, y'all talking about my lateness. I'm out here trying to save souls. And y'all talking about my lateness, when I think about the issues they had as a group, I think it spawns, part based on the question I asked, which is, okay, they have this rise, it's meteoric. You have big egos in the group. Obviously, I think most artists have pretty big egos to do what they do. And you have one, maybe Wyclef, who sees himself as a musical leader, and the other one in Lauryn, who's getting most of the attention. And eventually, that led to friction within the group. There are rumors of like romantic involvement, and they split. But when things ended for them, it wasn't all good. I mean, you listen to Lost Ones from Lauryn's album, and that was like a really cutting, public dig at Clef and what was going on with the group. So how do you think they overcame this?
So, and let's take it one step deeper. I'm always fascinated with these tipping point moments in hip hop. Nas and Tupac meeting, you and I spoke about it recently, and Nas talks about it on Death Row East, meeting in the park, and like what could have come out of that had Tupac lived. You can go on and on of just these different moments that shifted culture. And so the Fugees take a break. From what I understand, they win the Grammy for Best Rap Album in 1997 for the album they had released the prior year. They also win another one for Best R&B Performance for Killing 'Em Softly. They were up for Album of the Year, which again speaks to just how big the score was. They get incredibly paid. In 2016, Pras does an interview with Vlad TV, and he said that, because of the group not doing so well with Blunted on Reality, it wasn't like they were offered a ton of money, and Diamond D actually told me one time that he has not seen much at all, if anything, from this album because they didn't clear a lot of the samples at the front. So later on, when artists came to get paid, producers and other role players in the album weren't properly compensated. But the Fugees themselves, according to Pras, they took, among the three of them, a $135,000 advance to make the album. And like Outkast, like Death Row, like Gang Starr, they had their own studio. So their costs were, apart from whatever samples they cleared, probably to a minimum. They had Diamond on the album, The Outsiders, and John Forte. But like those were emerging, apart from Diamond, those are emerging crews. So it's not a big budget album that way. And then it takes off. So because they had taken such a low advance, it's easy to recoup, especially with a #1 album. And they get paid. Like they had every reason to stay in the group. But, they all sort of like, NWA or Wu-Tang or Bone Thugs and Harmony. Of course, these are three artists that want to do their own thing. In 97, Wyclef makes The Carnival. Lauryn and Pras participate on the album. They're on the album. I think oftentimes people think of the Fugees making the score and then boom, everything goes black. And that's not it. But in 97, Lauryn Hill becomes a mother. She has a son, Zion. And according, which she made a song about. And according to Wyclef's memoir, which came out 9 years ago, he says that the group fell apart when Lauryn Hill was pregnant and she wanted a paternity test from Wyclef because the two had been romantically involved for years, at that point for years. And, throughout history, that's happened in groups. I think of Fleetwood Mac being one. I mean, can you think of another where there's members of the group that are kind of behind the scenes romantically involved?
It's hard to say. I think there were rumors about Prince, certainly with Sheila E. when they were touring. There are tons. There's tons of examples. A lot of stuff we probably don't even know about, but yeah.
Word. And by this point, by 97, Wyclef is getting married to another woman who I believe is still his wife today. I'm not sure of that. And, that behind the scenes romance comes to a halt. And Wyclef has accused Lauryn of jealousy. She demands the paternity test. And that, Zion, as far as the world knows, has been fathered by Rohan Marley, which is, one of Bob's younger sons. And that creates a huge tension in the group. And by 98, Lauryn comes out with Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, not just Lost Ones. There's other songs that people presume are references to not only Wyclef, but Pras. And Wyclef and Pras have always seemed to be a unified front. They're cousins. They just, in the years that have followed always seem to be on kind of one side of the table, Lauryn on another. And I'm paraphrasing, but Lauryn has said, like, look, I was exploited. Like, as a woman in this music industry, I was taken advantage of, you know, blase blah, and it's not fair. And so she puts out an album. Wyclef is all over Praz's debut, Ghetto Superstar, producing it, playing guitar in the title track with ODB and Maya. You know, and there's a huge rift that for the next few years they never recover from. And one of my great regrets in life, Reggie, is 2004. One of my journalistic mentors and my boss at the time, Chuck Creekmer of All Hip-Hop, hits me and he goes, yo, do you want to go to Brooklyn tomorrow to a Dave Chappelle thing? I think it's going to be special. And I was in Philly and I didn't go. I was just like, oh man, that's a bus ride and a train ride. And if it ends late, how am I going to get back and blah. And of course,
wait, this is the Dave Chappelle block party.
Yeah,
oh,
which
wow.
was
Okay.
crazy because at that show, the Fugees reunited. But between 98 and 2004, it's like boom, radio silence, because Wyclef isn't really talking on the issue. He's certainly not saying what he said later in his memoir, because that came as a giant revelation. Praz kind of distances himself entirely, you know, kind of fades from the spotlight, isn't, you know, he's the least, you know, I shouldn't even say active, but it's not like Praz is going to go out and do touring on his own. And Lauryn, you know, apart from the MTV concert, just kind of disappears a little bit. And then they make this impromptu thing, which when I think of Dave Chappelle's block party, I don't know about you, but that is the next thing I think of, is that was the Fugees reunion. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge moment. And, you know, just the crazy thing is it wasn't even the biggest moment of the film. The film was just such a impactful part of culture. I got to go back and look at it again because there are just so many moments. I remember Erica was a big part of it, but yeah. But it was weird because, like you said, there was no build up. It was a surprise, obviously a great surprise, but then there was nothing that came of it either, you know? So,
well, there kind of was, if I can interject. I mean, well, that, go ahead.
There was, and I know where you're going, but I'm just going to say, like, a lot of times when something like that happens, it kicks off like another tour. Right. So think about, like, you know, what happened with Outkast a few years ago and what's happened with Tribe. You know, we alluded to this a little bit. I just watched Beats, Rhymes, and Life again yesterday. And despite the tension that lingered within the group, there were moments when they came together and it wasn't just a one-off. It continued for an extended period of time. And then they kind of like retreated back to their own corners. But so, go ahead.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, that moment happens, and J. Cole, who we're going to talk about, you know, he's on the film. If you watch Dave Chappelle's block party, in the crowd.
Oh, is that right? Oh,
yeah, because I think he was at St. John's at the time. But yeah, I mean, nothing happens. And it's funny, you mentioned Tribe and Outkast. The Fugees, Tribe, and Outkast are all signed to Sony. And from what I understand, all three of those groups have some sort of contractual obligation to their record label, because presumably whenever there's success and acclaim, the label is going to extend their contracts. So the Fugees, not unlike Tribe, not unlike Outkast, have had these things to fill. And then the next year in 2005, they make their first televised reunion appearance at the BET Awards, which I have to admit, I must have been in college, didn't have cable. I didn't even necessarily remember that, but they did a 12-minute medley of their hits. And then with that, kind of to your point, they released a single called Take It Easy, which it's so funny to me because, you know, I don't know about you, but that's not on the top of my mind. Oftentimes I think that the Fugees kind of ended in the 90s. When you think of the Fugees, do you remember the one extra record they gave us?
Not remotely. I got to go back and listen to it, because I don't even know if I heard it back then. It doesn't ring a bell at all.
We had alluded to it on AFH, but even, you know, I listened to the record and it's funny, for a group that I believe helped drive culture in a major way during the mid to late 90s. They come back in 2005, which is a huge transitional time in hip hop. I mean, that's the 50 Cent, the T.I., the, you know, G-Unit, Dem Franchise Boys era, and it's chasing. The record lacks what we love about the Fugees, but it's on the DSPs today, released by Sony. I mean, it's not this record that is covered up like, you know, some of these records that like Tribe later put out, or, you know, they really did come back together, but it was uneventful. And within that year, they already go to now speaking ill of each other.
Well, let me. So I'll say two things. So one, if that record had performed and really taken off, I do think they would have had a reunion, right? That was probably the test. Let's see, where we stand. We got this heat from the BET Awards. We did, Chappelle. Maybe it's time. They put the record out. It bricks, and end of story, right? That's one of those moments in time where had it gone a different way, and I just finished Loki, so I'm all about the multiverse right now. So I think we have at least a reunion tour then, and maybe even another album that pops up. But another thing, and it goes back to our point about anniversaries and there needing to be a certain amount of time for it to really matter to people. 7-year anniversary, no one cares about that. I think if they had put that record out, 10, 15 years later, and then giving people time enough to kind of miss them and let it breathe instead of just an extended hiatus, that record might have had a different impact and they might have gone on tour and had a very different kind of arc. That I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it's interesting too because at that point they're 9-10 years removed from the score, and I think your point earlier about Lauryn and the way that she's spoken most recently in the Nas feature, but even in an essay she's written, I think Lauryn in the public perception shoulders the blame for the Fugees, whereas I think her point is a valid one, of yo, you guys are siding with, the patriarchy on this one. And maybe I was taken advantage of and I was the other woman, but I'm not Yoko Ono. I'm not to blame for this. And that doesn't mean that, Yoko should be either. And Wyclef has gone on to, produce massive hits for Shakira, really enjoy an active solo career, had a foray in politics. But after that point, those tensions boil up again. And Pras re-enters to make what I think is one of the craziest proclamations is he said, George Bush and Osama bin Laden are more likely to have a latte together than me get back in the studio with Lauryn Hill. I'm sort of paraphrasing. Pretty direct quote though. And Wyclef said the same. And he really outs Lauryn and says that she needs psychiatric help. And again, I mean, that's a diss, and especially back then, I don't think we were talking about mental health with the care and concern that we are now. And that gets these these three members further apart. And we really don't hear about them much after that in the context of each other. Wyclef releases his memoir. And then more recently, we covered this on AFH, a leak happened where Hot 97, played a Fugees record that was kind of represented as a new joint, which was a giant troll. And Lauryn makes a rare statement of, that's a leak. And that was recorded years ago when we were kind of back in the studio, presumably 05. And she said, I suspect I know who's behind it. Doesn't name names, but to me, and tell me if you feel differently, I felt that was her going at presumably Wyclef, possibly Pras too.
Possibly. Another possibility is that it was a label. And the label's trying to generate interest, and it gets hard to resist if a record gets a big reaction, the allure of coming back, and that part of what I want to talk about too is, okay, there's a lot of history there. We know this. And, bin Laden and bin Laden and Bush never had that latte. So how do you think we got to a place where Lauryn, Pras, and Wyclef could actually not only reunite to celebrate, but go on tour together? I got a couple of possibilities I want to throw at you. So one is money, right? There's, I think that egos start to subside after time, especially when the spotlight has eased off of people and none of them have the spotlight the way they did before. Two, the money is probably significant at this point and matters more now that the spotlight has subsided. But I don't think that money is enough, because if it was just about money, I think they would have done this a long time ago, and they would have continued to put out albums and continued to tour, because that's a lot of money that's left off the table. So I think that, maybe money is a part of it, but I think it's a couple more things too. So one is the nostalgia part that you were talking about. I think that they are, I think they are human beings, and human beings, time does heal all. These cliches are around for a reason. And even if they're not in a place where they're hanging out backstage and like, reminiscing over old times and things like that. I think they understand the importance of the moment and what they did together. And it's enough to kind of overcome whatever the friction was, at least temporarily, so that they can acknowledge this and they understand that it only comes around once, these 25th anniversaries and significant milestones like that. The other could be a little bit of ego. I think that over time, people miss that spotlight, and this is that massive shot of dopamine. I think that for Lauryn, that must have happened with the reaction to the Nas verse, because it was such universal acclaim for who she is and a reminder of how great she can be. And I think that the feedback that comes with this is something that artists crave and will always do. But what do you think? Why do you think they chose now? They were able to put it aside.
I like that. And I know that there's a cynical reaction out there that, because Lauryn Hill had a public battle with the IRS, that people, she needs money. I don't believe that. I really don't believe that. I think this is about legacy. I think money helps, sure. But, that cliche of, if you don't talk about yourself, you're left to what other people say about you is really true. And I feel that one of the reasons why A Tribe Called Quest made their final album was because Beats, Rhymes, and Life, well, a great documentary, it doesn't portray Q-Tip in the greatest light, and, I think he and Phife had a real brotherhood. And what's been said after Phife's passing, because they kept that recording secret, that's apparent. I mean, these guys loved each other since they were teenagers. And if they don't make that album, then Q-Tip and Phife passes as he did, then Q-Tip looks a certain type of way. I think artists are very, very, very cognizant of legacy because of so much being said and written about them. I think that's why you get 50 Cent and Game taking a flick together. That's why you get Snoop and Suge Knight taking a flick together. That's why 2 different times Jay-Z and Dame Dash have had these peace moments that later, Dame will say something and it'll kind of undo that. And I feel that the Fugees are so talented. And let's take it one step further. Oftentimes, you and I spoke recently about Drake's legacy. People act, and it's so erroneous. And we didn't even mention the Fugees. We were talking about Heavy D, we were talking about Zero, we were talking about Nate Dogg. But the Fugees brought a great sense of vocal melody to hip hop, and they are not given the credit they deserve. And I feel like sometimes that happens because this is a group that diverged so many times, at least 10 years ago, going on 25. And coming back together, I think, allows them their proper place in history. And it allows a much nicer, kinder chapter where 3 different artists don't have to be spending their time talking about each other in a negative light.
So you think it's a combination of all 3, ego and wanting to define the narrative and shape their own kind of destiny in terms of what the group means to people, recognizing the moment and understanding its place and wanting to honor it, even if it means, putting aside differences, and the money is going to be good too. So you think it's all 3?
Absolutely. And behind the scenes, there very well could be an opportunity that allows this group to get out of its obligations, if those still exist, to the label. And I don't know if they would at this point, but Sony is one of those labels that is very clever about, they've already, when Lauryn talked about it in February, of just like, hey, a fan reminded me of this announcement, she even plugged merchandise coming soon. And we're living in a time right now where, I don't know about you, but when I see people in their teens, 20s, and 30s, they're wearing shirts with TLC or Tupac or Ice Cube on them. There are so many licensing opportunities, and the Fugees are a nostalgia app. So this could be an opportunity for them to turn the page, legacy, financially, label obligations, all of those things. And yeah, money's nice too. I can't imagine these 3 artists are hurting for it, but we all want to revenue we all want to monetize the great things that we've done.
I'm gonna go one step further, and this is like pure speculation, and it's not thinking about them specifically, but it's thinking about human beings generally. And I think that the last year in particular, and we mentioned Phife Dawg and his passing too, has caused people at the age of the Fugees, which I would assume is like late 40s, like, creeping up on 50, to understand their mortality and see that it's not guaranteed. And I think a lot of times these beefs continue because people think that, at some point, it'll pass and we'll make our amends and like it'll be fine. But tomorrow's not guaranteed anymore. And so I think losing all the greats we've lost over the last year and the ones that have passed over the last 5 to 10 years, from Nate Dogg to Five to whoever, probably help to heal some of those wounds too.
I think that's a great point, and I think we're no longer living in a time. I mean, one of the best things you can do is just piece it up. I firmly believe, there's this upcoming music festival in LA. I believe it's next month. It might be November, but I look closely, and we even put this in one of our recent articles about Ice Cube and Scarface doing a potential versus. Ice Cube, Dub C, and Mac 10 are all in the same bill at this festival. I firmly believe we're going to see a Westside Connection pop-up reunion. We are going to see more and more of this. Wyclef has pieced it up with Cannabis. Cannabis has pieced it up with LL. It's not cool to have distance, and this group, yeah, you care about each other. These three people made each other famous. All that came after that was because of the score. Sure, they had each done things prior to that, but they became superstars because of what they did together. And to me, I mean, it's funny. One thing I will note, to your point about the jokes, from what I read on Pitchfork, they were 4 hours late to New York. But that said, it came with a 21-piece orchestra. Wyclef freestyled. He rallied for the Biden administration to do more for the people of Haiti, which is great. I mean, the Fugees doesn't get talked about often enough, but they've done a lot of charitable things. They've been very political, especially, for the nation of Haiti. They donated their studio to provide shelter for people. And I just think it's a really good moment for hip hop.
Well, whatever the reason, salute to them. It's great to see them back. One of hip hop's all-time great groups. I, for one, don't
think we're going to get.
I was going to say, yeah, I, for one, don't think that the chapter is closed on them. And I think that, or I should say the book, I think there's another chapter. I think that based on this reaction, they're going to see how much people do want Fugees music. Clearly, people want Lauryn music. Like I said, she's in fighting shape in terms of her verses. I think Clef probably stays in shape. So it would not surprise me if, at the end of this, there's another Fugees album that comes out. And if Salam could get in the mix too, because he seems to be that guy who helps to be the glue for them, I think it could be special.
Yeah, and Wyclef as a producer, and let's just shout out, because he was very much a part of the success too, Jerry Wonder, Duplessis, their sound has evolved. We haven't gotten the Wyclef's, Fugees sound, in my estimation, since the early 2000s off of his solo records. And it was never the same without Lauryn and Pras. So if they can come back with that formula, I think that would be great. It was great what Tribe did. And I also think it was great what Premier did with Gangstar, 2 years ago. And again, taking legacy and giving a really peaceful final chapter on the group,
Yeah, man. So you mentioned J. Cole and being in the crowd in Chappelle's block party. That's crazy. I got to go back and look at that for sure now. Cole is back in the news this week too. He dropped a song called Heaven's EP, and it was just a video. I'm not even sure if it's on DSPs. Have you checked to see if it's on?
No, you know what? I didn't even look. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll add it to the playlist if it is. But, so he drops this Lucy, right? And he's done this a few times. He's had some very impactful Lucy's. He's not like Drake where he's dropping them like, every few months or so. But when he does, they make noise. And so some of the ones that I think are noteworthy over the years are False Prophets. And often, he does this where he'll take a familiar beat and put his stamp on it. So Heaven's EP is over Drake's Pipe Down. And we'll get into that because it's significant, I think, based on the lyrics and also kind of some things he says. But False Prophets was over the same loop that Joey Badass used for was his first single. It's off 1999.
Not Survival Tactics.
No. Waves.
Wait,
So Joey Badass is Waves, which I think is a Jay Dilla beat, right? Well,
not my area of expertise. Yeah.
so Waves, Joey Badass's joint is crazy. And Cole dropped this. He again did it as a video to start. He's sitting on a bus, on the back of the bus, and the song is an indictment about Kanye and how he's kind of lost touch over the years with his popularity and diverged from what he stood for back in the day with the consciousness and stuff like that. But then the second verse, a lot of people speculated, and ultimately came out that it was about Wale, and really caring way too much about what the press said about him, and being too concerned about people not giving us props instead of just kind of living in his own greatness. And then he had High for Hours. This was an original production. In this song, he talks about Obama going to the White House and going in with questions about why Obama's not doing more for Black folks. And he talks about how he asked him that question, even though he was nervous. And he's very descriptive about the moment. And he says, Obama gave him an answer that was satisfactory, but then he added a coda, and he said, this stuff, brother, and not using those words, politics. Like, so acknowledging that he had a different understanding and more sympathy for Obama's position. After that, a third was Middle Child, which was gigantic, became Cole's biggest record ever. And that was about him being kind of squeezed between two generations, the generation of the 90s that people consider to be the goats of hip hop, and this current generation that doesn't really care about that and doesn't care about him, and kind of alluding to the dust up that he had, with an entire generation of people with 1989 and
85.
85, yeah, 1985.
You're thinking of Taylor Swift, man.
Yeah. And it really kind of gets into that. And then the last one was last summer, Snow on the Bluff. And that's a song where he's kind of going at No Name, who was kind of calling him out for not doing enough in the Black Lives Matters movement. And he got taken to task for that, for attacking a Black woman on wax, even though it wasn't as much of an attack as it was commentary and a response to things that she had said as well. But in any case, Cole uses these Lucy's as moments of self-reflection, because they're always very, very pensive. And I think what people miss a lot of times is that often the criticism and the focus is much more on him than it is anyone else, and the other mentions are kind of incidental. But then also, I think he very strategically uses them to accomplish another purpose. In this case, he's done them to announce albums, like I think False Prophets was just before, I forget which album, maybe KOD, but one of his albums came out. In this case, it happened 3 days before his tour commenced. And I'm going to the show next week. I can't wait. I think you and I, last time I saw him was when you and I went together. But why do you think he decided to drop this now?
I think there's a huge conversation going on in hip hop, one that, we have been covering on AFH that has a few figures in it, notably Drake, Kanye West, and Kendrick Lamar, possibly Pusha T too. And I also think, Cole's Lucy's work because, few artists are as thematic with their albums. And sometimes I feel that Cole has a State of the Union address that he wants to get out there fairly urgently. And he uses that don't necessarily work in the context of his albums. And I feel like it's got to feel empowering to be able to make a song on Tuesday and put it out for Wednesday morning. And he is of the generation that, thanks to SoundCloud and Dat Piff and other things, was able to do that. And he's still doing it. And I think as we've watched Kendrick Lamar smoking on your top 5 and Drake and Kanye, kind of one-upping each other in a number of ways, Cole needed an opportunity to say, hey, look, I'm out here. And also, Kendrick had made a comment about albums this year. And I believe up until about late August, that J. Cole dropped the most significant album in the mainstream facing lyrical space. Would you agree with that?
I agree. He's still at the top of my list for albums this year, with Evidence being, right there next to him. I think those are the two, my two favorite albums thus far. I love Skyzoo's album too. But Cole, attention spans are so short these days. And, with Kanye dropping, with Drake dropping, with Kendrick like knocking on the door, I think it's easy to kind of forget about Cole having done what he did. Now, the other thing is that I believe that the Grammy consideration is the window closes, I think, September.
October. 30th. Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's September 30th. So maybe October 1st is the first day. So if he's being strategic, and I think he is, he's rekindling interest and raising awareness in his album again, in addition to the tour. And if you recall, KOD was not nominated for Best Rap Album with that, which I still think is one of the greatest travesties of the last 5 years with Grammy stuff. Because to me, that was the best album that year, like hands down. And for it to not even get a nomination is ridiculous. So I think this is Cole very astutely reminding folks, yo, I got a project out. Don't forget it. Don't leave it off, and then, like you said, sending a message that, yeah, Drake and Kendrick have resurfaced, and we'll get into that in a second with the lyrics, but don't forget I'm here too.
That's really interesting too, because the Grammys, are voted upon by, a committee. And I've had several people in the last week ask me if I'm on that committee. And while I know people that are, I'm not, and I never sought it out, but I wish that I was, because I think that I understand, as do you, we listen to a lot more than 10 rap albums a year. And, I'm happy to hear at this point in the game, you shouting out Evidence, which is still my AOTY so far. But yeah, Cole was giantly snubbed, and it's a great reminder to let people that only have a short attention span and might only be caught up in CLB and in Donda and, whatever else, that, yo, I'm here and I made a good album. And also, I think that Cole had a very interesting point too, which is, we're watching. I mean, Kendrick Lamar knows how to spin controversy. He did that with Control. He did that, in my opinion, with Family Ties with Baby Keem. He knows, he likes to be competitive, and in a very surgical, performance-driven way, he likes to throw some elbows and be the best. It reminds me of Michael Jordan, looking Allen Iverson in the eye and just stunting on him, and that just competitive spirit. And I think J. Cole has some of that, but he uses this as an opportunity too to say, hey, I've accomplished all I have without controversy, especially as you see Drake and Kanye going back and forth. It's just a kind of reminder of, yo, let the skills pay the bills too.
Word. And so let's get into his lyrics, because this dude is one of the most honest and transparent artists out there. I think in any genre. He talks about, on his album, he talks about so much, Let Go My Hand. It's so deep, in terms of his own childhood and his awareness now as a father trying to raise a son, and altercations he's had and all that stuff. But in this one, he talks about a few things. So, he says that I represent intelligent, brothers that grew up harshly. Have you ever heard Cole frame, that's just such a interesting way to frame who he is and what he means. And, you just don't hear people describing themselves that way. But what do you think about that? Did that strike you?
Yeah, I mean, I like it, because I think to this day, even though, we're almost 10 years past it, we go, Kendrick Lamar was the good kid in the Mad City. And Drake is Drake. Drake is, the superstar that grew up acting, but also will tell you about hard times and his parents split and all that. And it's just an interesting way of J. Cole of saying, this is what I am. And I like that line a lot, because I feel that at various points in his career, J. Cole is chided a bit for his intelligence or for his, intentions with things. But he's also reminding you too, if you look at some of my songs, I didn't have a silver spoon upbringing by any measure.
Yeah, I mean, the commentary has been there throughout, right? Since his early mixtapes, He's always very proudly talked about St. John's and going to college, which I think is a phenomenal message because you just don't hear it in hip hop enough. People glorify the street life and stuff like that without putting focus in some ways denigrating the education piece of it. So I love that Cole does that, but he's also saying, listen, I'm not a sucker either. I wasn't out there shooting and selling, but I saw things around me, much like Nas did. And was affected by these things. So I'm providing a voice to others out there. But to hear him just describe it so succinctly was deep for me. He also talks about, and this is something he's been talking about quite a bit, if you watch that documentary leading up to the off season, he's questioned himself and whether or not he's lost something with the fame, whether it be artistic credibility or, being real or true to himself. And he talks about whether he's still contributing value, after success on this song. It's a constant battle of his, this fight of commercial versus substantive, and I want to talk about that in a bit too. But then I think the thing that really, and so one of the things, so I think Drake and Kendrick question themselves quite a bit too, but they do it in different ways. So Kendrick, if you start to listen to dissect and both for To Pimp a Butterfly and for Damn, and really study his music, there is a religious narrative unlike any that I can ever recall in hip hop in almost every body of work of Kendrick's. It was right there in front of us. You got the Minister Society and Boys in the Hood comparisons for Good Kid, Mad City. But at the end of the day, it was a story of redemption, and accepting Jesus in order to, be redeemed. Like that was the narrative, the dominant narrative throughout, from the skits to the prayers and things like that. Sing about me, I'm dying of thirst. And that wasn't it. Like every single one of Kendrick's albums has a pretty strong religious narrative to it. So for him, he's questioning his place on this earth. What happens on earth stays on earth. He's questioning that and his spirituality versus his human flaws. That's Kendrick's question, right? For Drake, his question seems to revolve around self-esteem. He's this guy who is arguably the biggest artist in the world, and we're getting crazy flack and attention recently on our podcast where we dared to say that Drake had more commercial success than Michael Jackson. No comments on greatness or influence or cultural impact, because I wouldn't say that. I think that Michael still has more cultural impact than just about any artist that's ever lived. But in terms of pure like commercial sales and success and stats in this era, especially given the magnitude of media that people have to face, I think Drake, stands there, but I'm not gonna rehash that now.
Yeah.
In any case, for Drake, he's this guy who's achieved monumental success, right? Taking away any comparisons, he's gigantic in the space, and yet he's still got these self-esteem things, right? Like he constantly talks about his insecurities, and so there's that juxtaposition about people who have achieved a ton but still have self-esteem issues. So that's what he questions. For Cole, it's different, right? It tends to be more about his artistic merit and where does he stand, and a lot of that is the feedback that he gets, which he references in another line where he talks about he's always getting the bronze from people. People give either Drake or Kendrick, depending on what camp you fall, the gold and the silver. And he seems to think that he always gets that bronze. He's always third place or afterthought, almost like the prize of the Fugees type thing, right? So you and I have talked about this a bit, but I don't think we've talked about it enough and really entertained it. Is it possible that J. Cole, and we have an entire podcast devoted to this, is the GOAT of his generation? People think Kendrick because of critical acclaim. People think Drake because of commercial success. But I would argue that while Cole hasn't had the same critical acclaim as Kendrick, he has had more so than Drake. And while he hasn't had the same commercial success as Drake, he's had more so than Kendrick. And he's consistently put out incredibly high quality albums since 2014, Forest Hills Drive. I personally don't think he's had a miss since then. He drops more frequently than Kendrick. and with more critical acclaim than Drake. So is it possible, or do you think that he has not gotten his due as the potential real GOAT of this generation?
Do I think it's possible that he is the GOAT of this generation?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think his highlights are to the level of Drake's or Kendrick's. That's just me saying that. But it's funny. You're great at basketball analogies. In a way, I'm thinking of, football, where, everyone spent all of those years talking about Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. And meanwhile, perhaps J. Cole is the Drew Brees, who's, doing it and just doesn't get the fanfare of the other two guys. But I think that Kendrick's highs are higher. And I would say, I think that J. Cole, I listen to much more of his music than I do Drake's. I think he struggles to occupy the spotlight and make memorable, far-reaching songs the way that Drake does. And that's no knock on him, because I believe if there's a number 3, if there is a bronze of that generation, on the lyrical side, I'm not talking about Future, I'm not talking about, Travis, but I think that J. Cole's there, and cemented is so. But that doesn't mean that can't change.
All right, so I'm gonna give you a different sports analogy. People talk about Michael Jordan as being the GOAT, and there's an entire generation now that talks about LeBron being the GOAT, right? And occasionally Kobe will slip into that. But I'm gonna say that a lot of people forget about Tim Duncan. Mm-hmm. Tim Duncan has got 5 rings. Tim Duncan, put up a double-double for the vast majority of his career. He was quiet, unassuming, but best believe, when it came down to it, he was the guy who was going to win you that game, and his body of work was consistent throughout time. But he wasn't a flashy dude, right? And Cole talks about that too. Cole talks about the fact that, he's not comfortable on red carpets. He's not that dude out on social media, talking about how lit he is and how everything is popping. He's quiet, and perhaps that's been a disservice to his legacy, because he doesn't draw the same attention as people out there, kind of raising the flag and, and setting themselves on fire, to borrow an analogy from our brother Justin Hunt. But that doesn't mean that he's any less great. And I think the Tim Duncan analogy stands. People don't talk about Duncan in that way because he wasn't a flashy dude, and he was never the guy, drawing attention to himself. He wasn't an activist. He was just the guy who went to work every day and, and was an all-star at work every day, but put his head down and came back home, and collected chips. I think that's Cole. And I think because of that, it's much more of a legitimate conversation than people allow as to who's the greatest between the 3 of them.
Yeah, and I like that analogy. I mean, I think that's a fitting one. And Tim Duncan, those squads that won chips, he really focused on the team, as I remember. And J. Cole's done that. I mean, when we talk about the dynasties of Dreamville versus TDE versus OVO, J. Cole has made people around him look phenomenal, and he's had a very much a team-minded game, down to the recent resurgence of features, down to what he's done with his label and Revenge of the Dreamers. I like that analogy. I do think Cole could climb, and I love this song. I love that because I find this to be so much more interesting than that petty ish between Kanye, who I know is not part of this part of the discussion, and Drake. And I like that Cole just said, let's have a different aspect of this conversation.
Yeah, and you think about, so what Kendrick and Drake bring to the table, right? So Drake just brings bangers, and there's not necessarily a theme to most of his albums. It's just, there are themes within, but it's not like a unified, cohesive theme throughout. Yeah. And to me, that's what the off season is. The off season has a ton of bangers, and he's got features and things like that. And he's got some important things that he says throughout, but there's not a unified theme. I know it's all framed around the notion of him, going back to the time you got to put in between the season in order to get great, but there's not a real theme to the album. Kendrick, on the other hand, is a guy who is making albums, unified bodies of work. That was certainly the case for Good Kid, Mad City, and for Damn. To Pimp a Butterfly was there too, although I think it was not as clear as it was for those 2 albums. But then you go to KOD, and this is a guy who is, in a year where we lose Mac Miller and Lil Peep, putting out an album warning of the perils of addiction, and not just to drugs, but to money and sex and technology and all these things that lure us in. And very consistently and cohesively throughout touches on all these different forms of addiction. Talks about Kevin Hart, like videos that support it. That to me is one of the greatest artistic statements we've had in years. And yet he doesn't get recognized for it. So he plays in both their spaces, and I think does it incredibly well, but just doesn't get the props for it, But it's interesting because one of the people he name checked actually joined him on stage at his opening date for his tour now in Miami, and that was Drake. And so Drake came out and said, I got to say this just because I don't always want to have a heartfelt moment where we're on stage together and shit, but you did the pipe down freestyle the other day, right? You said in the freestyle about they handed you the bronze and whatever, me and Kendrick. I want you to understand something. You are without a doubt one of the greatest rappers to touch a mic. I want to let you know there's way too many people in the world that think and know J. Cole is at the top of the pole position. I love you with all my heart. You're my brother. You're one of my favorite artists, and I appreciate you having me out here. Now, what do you think about that? Is that Drake being hyperbolic in a moment, or you think that's Drake being sincere?
I think that's Drake being sincere and keeping it a bean. And I thought that was, at a time when everything has been so competitive. I don't know that Drake stands to gain anything from that. I mean, Drake looks like a cool, heartfelt guy at a time when maybe his album isn't being celebrated as he would have hoped. But I don't see this as a strategic move in any way about that. I think this is, there were other artists in that conversation, but these guys came up together. They were stars of the blogs, and then they became stars of the charts, and now they're stars of the world. And to have a moment where you can have two guys acknowledge each other that way, I thought was really phenomenal. And Drake is more than happy to say that there are people out there, and quite a few of them, that think that J. Cole is the best. I just thought that was great, man. And you're who told me about it, because oftentimes I think these like, hey, let's appear on stage together moments in hip hop are kind of corny. I don't think this is corny at all. I think that's great.
Yeah, no, I thought it was dope too. And of course, at the end of this song, Cole shares that sentiment about himself, right? He says that he's the one and the best one breathing, the best rapper breathing, basically. So I think that was dope. I think it was dope that Drake came out, and, I think if there's anything that like takes away from people hands down giving it to Drake is that, he is so huge. And like I said, we've been catching flack because of that Michael Jackson episode. And someone who is, I think, a precursor to Drake in terms of injecting melody into hip hop, in terms of having huge pop success with rap, is Ja Rule. And, here's the irony for me. Ja Rule, his career was kind of killed by 50 Cent. Mm-hmm. But 50 Cent killed Ja Rule using the exact same formula. It's really odd to me that people don't talk about that more. But you got songs like 21 Questions and Many Men and In the Club, and 50 is singing on all those hooks, right? Like every single one.
Even PIMP, yeah.
Yeah, even PIMP in the Candy Shop. He's using Ja Rule's formula to kill him, right? But because he has the narrative of I'm a dude who got shot 9 times and survived it, he's given a pass. Even though Ja Rule has very similar street credibility, and came up doing songs like Murder and, as part of Murder Inc., It's just crazy to me. But Ja Rule kind of had his redemption moment, as we took our break. And that was in a Verzuz with Fat Joe. And that happened, I think it was a Tuesday night. It was a big moment. It didn't have the same impact as Lox versus Dipset. But I would say that for Ja Rule personally, it had similar impact in that it reminded people as to how great his music has been. And he's taken a lot of hits over the years with the, Fire Festival and things like that. But those hits are legit, man. They endure. And a lot of people went in thinking Fat Joe was going to take this, myself included, because Joe has got street bangers. He's got stuff for the underground. He's got huge club anthems, number one hits himself. and he's been current he's stayed relevant now for 25 years or so, from FloJo all the way through Sunshine this year. I thought it was Joe's battle to lose. Interestingly, he didn't play any of his R. Kelly stuff because of the obvious reasons. So maybe that took away from some of the bigger bangers he could have played too. But most people's takeaway was that Ja Rule won that battle. But whether or not you agree with that, I think it was a great showing for Ja Rule. And he was on Drink Champs recently. And so this is, a lot of times they tape those, pretty far in advance, but this one was definitely taped post Verzuz. Mm-hmm. And he talked about it. And, Nori said, and he didn't mince words, he said, listen, like, I was glad to see that because a lot of people, thought you were a sucker, and, Ja said that was because of his commercial success. And it made me think, man, why is it that in hip hop, we have a problem with two things that like other genres don't have a problem with. And one is legacy. We've talked a lot about how, the current generation often doesn't have respect for those who came before them and the history, and how that's just an odd thing because those are the people who laid the foundation and, you're building on it, but you got to respect what came before you. And that's unique to hip hop. But the second thing is, we as a culture seem to turn our noses up at the people who have the most success. Jay-Z is now in a lot of contexts vilified because he's had such incredible success. Same thing for Drake, Kendrick. We've seen it. We were riding with Kendrick way before he became like a mega pop superstar and Pulitzer Prize winner. And he was a darling in underground circles. And now that he's had commercial success, all of a sudden people are like, think he's lame and stuff. And the ringleader for that is Drake, right? Like Drake, when he first came out with the mixtape, So Far Gone, people thought he was dope. Dude could spit, he could sing, but very quickly the tables turned on him. So why do you think it is that commercial success diminishes credibility in hip hop?
It's tricky. I think that, and I say this as a white man, but I feel that, there's a history in Black culture of accusing folks of going Hollywood. Like, that expression goes back a long way. And I feel that then when you add hip hop, there's always been this just aspect of at what point does one sell out? And, I was not and I said this on a recent podcast, I was not of a fan of Drake and his come up. There were moments that I liked, but I was really concerned about the guy becoming the biggest star in the world, crutching R&B to be a hip hop artist. I thought that could take the trends of the genre to a different place. And I think
there it is. Jake Payne hates R&B.
No, man, let hip hop be hip hop. But also too, specific to the question, and in the 90s, when hip hop starts to get money, when they start to get, airplay on top 40 stations, MTV, you have Hammer, you have Vanilla Ice, you have Young MC, Tone Loc, you have these artists that are rising to the top, whereas, your Cool Keiths, your Cool G Raps, even your Big Daddy Kanes and Rakims, Ice Cubes, DOCs are not getting that attention, Cole Mo D. And I think there will always be a, why are you celebrating that when you could be celebrating this? And then we've seen it, kind of expand over time. And again, part of that I said as cultural, and I hope I'm not misspeaking. Tell me if I am, but do you agree with that at all?
Well, you say let hip hop be hip hop, but if you go back to the roots of hip hop was, founded on like disco breaks. You think about Curtis Blow, obviously Sugar Hill Gang, but they have like a tarnished legacy because of what that was, but people weren't thinking about that back then. Grandmaster Flash, they use a lot of disco breaks. Like it was you couldn't get more like R&B and commercial than what rap was doing to start. It was party music, and that's where its genesis is. So I don't know where we got to the point where we couldn't have fun and have musicality in records without it being hip hop. And in terms of the cultural thing, I'm not sure if I agree with it, but if that is a mentality, then that's backwards too, right? Like if we can't allow our hip hop stars to grow and become successful if people have to stay unsuccessful and, not amass wealth in order to be credible, then that's backwards. The reason why people are doing this is, one, artistic expression, but two, to make a living. And so, and I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. So why not celebrate those who do it so well that it allows them to not only make a living for themselves, but for, provide for their families, for their crews, for entire communities in some cases, and even bigger when you get to the philanthropic level of like a Jay-Z and people like that. So I just think the mentality is backwards. And I think it's crabs in a barrel kind of mentality. And I think it's something that we have to examine and stop. And I think it's something that is new. You think about people like Run DMC, when they had Walk This Way, it was gigantic for them. They didn't lose credibility. They had My Adidas, and they had Peter Piper, and they had, other songs like that. King of Rock, they were never accused of selling out or trying to cross over, or Raising Hell. Like, that was always part of them, acknowledging that their musical DNA lived much more expansively than just one particular genre. LL was the same way. When he put out I Need Love, he wasn't seen as a sucker. He was a dude who, like, was a sex symbol, and, girls wanted to be with him, dudes wanted to be him. That's what it was. So I don't understand when it took this turn.
That's a really good point. And I think there's always kind of a nonconformist attitude that we have just as pop culture of, hating on something. Yesterday I texted you and I was like, man, I hated on the Foo Fighters because I was upset that, Nirvana, I felt like they were pushing dirt on it. And I was a young guy. It didn't make sense, my logic with that. And with hip hop, I think Ja Rule had a comeback moment with New York. That record was massive. And standing with Fat Joe and with Jadakiss, that was a huge record. And I feel like Ja Rule got a last word moment at a time when 50 was the biggest rap star in New York. But what Ja did after that, I feel like he had some huge missteps. And whereas Fat Joe has had missteps in his career, he's had the opportunity to constantly evolve in a way that Ja hasn't. And yeah, things like the Fire Festival, or even that Foot Locker commercial some years ago where Ja Rule was the Uber driver, he's poked fun at himself, and it's been very odd. But I was happy to see Ja get a moment, because there are Ja Rule records that I really like. I might even use consider classic songs. And I was a Ja Rule fan in 1998. I thought Holla was a great single. And I admit that. And, I think that Verzuz is a really interesting platform because it can remind you of what you really liked about somebody, and it gives them the stage to be great. I don't think Fat Joe lost anything to Ja Rule. I think it was a little bit different than the Dipset battle. And I also think both of them had a lot to live up to come in after that. Because I don't think there's really any tensions there. I think some of it, they saw what had worked for Jadakiss and Styles P and Chic, and they tried to recreate it a little bit with some jabs, but it wasn't going to be that. But I think if the takeaway is that Ja Rule is a legitimate artist and should be treated with some respect beyond the 50 Cent conversation, then great, and that's kind of what I think it offered.
Yeah, absolutely. I was glad to see him get it, because I think that, I think that history will be kinder to him than the recent past was. And it goes back to the conversation we were having about Fugees and the significance of anniversaries. I think as time goes by and people get out of the moment and people grow and evolve, they start to see these things differently. I see you put in the document like Hammer. Hammer is a dude who also got clowned for his commercial success, but you go back, dude, I went to 2 Hammer concerts. I think it was 2. I went to the Pray Tour and the Please Don't Hurt 'Em. And Hammer put on one of the best shows I've ever seen in my life. Like him, Janet Jackson, like very few others had the pyrotechnics, the choreography, like the precision. Like that dude put on a show, and he has some bangers, man. Will Smith is another one. If you go back and listen to solo Will Smith stuff, like Getting Jiggy with It and Miami, those are dope songs. Young MC, Tone Loc, a lot of these people have songs that you put them on at a wedding or a birthday party or a barbecue now, and it's fun, man. It's just good fun. And so I don't have shade for all of it. I love it all, as you know, from Doom to Drake and everything in between. But you talked about Styles P and the you talked about the Locks versus Dipset. Styles P was in the news too because he did an article with GQ and he credited 6ix9ine in part for the versus strategy they took. And I think that raised a lot of eyebrows. But his point was that he saw that a lot of people are now getting more attention for what they're saying and doing offline than what they actually do, like in the ring with the music or in the studio. And so he wanted to tap into that energy in order to reach the youth and let them know about who the Locks were, people who might not know. And clearly it worked, so it just, I thought it was fascinating.
And that speaks to the J. Cole point too, because I feel like J. Cole, doesn't play to the 6ix9ine playbook, in the way that I think that Drake, and even to some degree, competitively speaking, that Kendrick does. And yeah, man, anytime I see somebody, I want to just tell them that what they're doing is so corny. After what Styles P said to Jim Jones with the jewelry, like that was my favorite line, to see him out of character like that. So
Yeah,
man,
yeah.
I thought that was cool.
So commercial versus credibility. I think that when you talk about those terms, there's no two people on the spectrum who are seemingly further apart than Drake and Benny the Butcher, right? Drake representing commercial success, Benny the Butcher representing credibility with everything that he's done with that Griselda movement. And Benny, I think over a year or so ago now, kind of teased the fact that he had a song with Drake in the tuck. And people, when you and I talked about it actually, and when he dropped his song with Lil Wayne, we said this might be a precursor. And the beautiful thing is that that song didn't in any way compromise Benny, but it did kind of evolve his sound a bit. Didn't make him sound too commercial. He was still Benny, but on a bit more accessible track. It wasn't a dark Derringer or Alchemist kind of track. But the song never manifested. It hasn't been on any Benny albums and he's had like probably 4 or 5 since then. It hasn't been on Drake's stuff. It wasn't on Certified Lover Boy. And recently that song was leaked. Did you get a chance to listen to it?
I didn't get a chance to listen to the leak. I saw Benny speaking about it. Did you?
Yeah, I listened to it. And I'll say it was okay. It didn't blow me away. It wasn't bad, but it was just okay. It wasn't the moment that I thought it would be. I personally like the Wayne record with Big Sean better, and some of the raw stuff that Benny has done. I think I'm more representative of where I'd like to see him go. It wasn't bad. It was cool. But, it's curious to me that it leaked. And, I'm curious as to what people will think about it when it finally comes out. I don't think he compromises himself in any way, though.
No, Benny talked about it on Twitch too before it leaked, and he said that he didn't know where it was going to end up because fans were asking him like, "Why you're not on Certified Lover Boy?" And he also said, he was a little bit busy to be. He said, "I don't concern myself with the features I don't get in regards to him not being on Donda." People say, "Oh, Griselda's on Donda," but it's Westside Gunn and Conway, and it's not Benny. And I thought that was interesting too because Benny has a very chippy verse on Hell on Earth Part 2 from Westside Gunn's new album, Hitler Wears Hermes 8 Side B, where he talks about getting a Grammy snub for Burden of Proof and, why his albums are better. And it's interesting too, he shouts out by name Tana Talk 3 and Burden of Proof. And you and I did a podcast on what Benny's, best albums are. It was interesting to kind of get his own take with that. And it's an interesting season for the Butcher.
Yeah. And you mentioned that Westside Gunn drop. Dude, I think that the companions, the first one and the second one from Hermes 8, are two of the better projects this year. I think both have dropped since we did our June playlist. I would put both of them, or certainly them as a combined effort, in my top 15 for sure. But have you got a chance to take a listen to that?
Yeah, I have. And I can say with confidence, I've never seen an artist this big be this prolific. Tupac didn't have the benefit of DSP technology. I think he relied on manufacturing and distribution. There was a run in the mid 2000s where Doom was putting out several albums a year that were often great at the same time. But Westside Gunn, I've never seen anyone just literally flood the game and maintain quality. And it's amazing. This is the last of a series that goes back 9 years, which I think is pretty incredible. And it's, watching an artist evolve in real time. And, shout out to Gunn and what he's accomplished. And I thought that side B, I prefer it to side A. I say that after just a few listens, but as we kind of head towards the end of the year, I'll have to give it some more consideration. But I really like that Hell on Earth Part 2 song you put on the podcast, on the playlist. And Gunn's just in fighting shape. Free Cutter with Jay Electronica, they have a great chemistry. And I also like Eddie Kingston on that album, which is the first Rome Streets feature since signing to Griselda. And we've talked about him a few times on this podcast, but Rome Streets is one of those guys that makes music that always kind of fits the Griselda aesthetic. And I'm glad to see him during an also prolific and incredible year get that attention from that association and spotlight.
Yeah, I love seeing what he's doing on these two projects in particular and bringing artists like that to the fore. So Rome, he's doing it with Makami too. And obviously he made Pray for Haiti with him. And that is definitely going to make my end of the year list at this point. Phenomenal album. And then also Stove Got Cooks, who dropped a mix, an album album last year that was great and started to generate some buzz. But I think that the stuff I've heard him do with Westside Gunn is even better. And it makes me really excited to hear what he's going to do for his next project.
Yeah, I mean, I just love the fact that Griselda sees guys that make music in a similar adjacent lane and embraces it instead of, and it's kind of the maturation of Gunn and company. I think there was, some like we can all win mentality that kind of hit them in like 2009. And if it's anything like what we've seen with what they've done with Boldy James, it's all good everything. And I just love the way that label moves. They build all these different lanes, but still come together. And Hell on Earth Part 2 is just such enjoyable. Listen, I'm glad you put it atop the playlist.
Word. So anything else catch your ear this week?
Yeah, man. I mean, moving towards the end, I'm just going to say my song of the week is from Blue. Blue put out a new album, The Color Blue, and it's spelled like his name. And then in parentheses, he adds an E. We recently had Blue and Mickey Fax on the podcast. They put out the Narrative EP recently, produced by Knots. And Blue is just in fighting shape, man. And I've said it before, but I think there's artists in hip hop that we hold to a certain album standard. Nas with Illmatic, Snoop with Doggy Style, and they've made other great music. And Blue, everyone talks about Below the Heavens, but there are so many other just really great bodies of work that he's been behind. And I'm really enjoying this new album. We're not sample snitches here. But one thing I will say is that, Blue and his team, which includes Exile on this one, they just don't give a damn about, so it kind of reminds me of Below the Heavens. It's just like, we're going to put this out in the name of true hip hop style. And, they had put out a first single called People Call Me Blue that I love. But my song of the week is Because the Sky is Blue. Every song on there has blue in the title. It's produced by J57, my man from Brown Bag All Stars. And they put out a video this week, and it's phenomenal rapping. It's great production. It's a beautiful marriage of the two. And for anyone that loves sample-based, thought-provoking, just kind of like, 90s minded hip hop, you got to check that project out, because that's been the one that I've played the most since Friday.
Word, that's dope. That's dope. I got to check out that. I want to check out the new D Smoke. And Mozzie put something out too. I started it, but I got to finish that. For me, my song of the week is Butter. We talked about the fact that Low End Theory turned 30 years old. That is one of the probably top 5 albums for me of all time. Definitely rap, maybe all time in any genre. And, watching Beatrons in Life yesterday, it was very, very meaningful seeing just how that foreshadowed what was to come for Phife. Really, really, really crazy. And Butter was that Phife Jog solo joint on that album. And for me, the emergence of Phife is what made Tribe what Tribe became. And so, shout out to them, shout out to him. But yeah, that's my song of the week.
Man, R.I.P. Phife. He was always so good to me. And shout out to Tribe. That's a true, if you were to give somebody a hip hop album that had never listened to hip hop before, Low End Theory is you know, as good as any I can think of, and credit to those gentlemen. So yeah, man, until we do it again, I hope we get that special guest. And if not, either way, we're gonna keep having some dope conversation.
Word. Always a pleasure, man.
Likewise, man. Yo,
All
have a
right.
good one.
Yeah,
Peace.
you too.